It's all about the complexity of history of these islands, and people need to get the opportunity to learn that the simplistic monotones of black and white really aren't the correct case. I suspect that probably the best way I can put it is 1916 is the year of tragedy, of missed opportunities. Opportunities that there were to make Ireland better, which unfortunately, by the way events ran, probably ended up making things significantly worse, at least in the short term, for a number of people. I suppose, given my position in the Alliance Party, I represent people who don't largely identify easily with issues around the Somme, insofar as the Somme was British imperialism, but perhaps do identify with the Somme in the context of family tragedy. I was at an event in the constituency on the morning of the 1st of July, which recorded in a small village, I think it was 8 deaths occurred during the First World War, 6 of which occurred at the Somme, 3 of which occurred on one morning. That's got to be significant into any community. And on the other side, of course, the events of Easter 1916 were, in my opinion, a tragedy which led to partition, led to difficulties which have persisted almost to the present day, although thankfully the last 18 years we've been managing to get over them a bit. I suppose one bit of me gets slightly concerned on the Unionist concern about the Somme, as if it was the only battle that was ever fought in the history of the world. That's probably very personal, because I had an uncle who obviously I never knew, who died ironically on the 11th of November 1940 when his ship was bombed. And if you've got that kind of feeling, you suggest that actually there was more to tragedy and suffering than simply one battle, even though it was the bloodiest battle, certainly affecting the British ever. I suspect the French, looking at Verdun, would take things slightly differently. So there was that kind of thing of, is it over-exaggerating one specific issue? And on the wider side, my grandmother was the teacher in a small national school in County Tyrone. On the wall in the house, until my cousin rebuilt it and now put away somewhere safely, was her certificate from her teacher training in Dublin, of the kind of thing which was then lost in terms of that kind of north-south contact as a result of the rising and partition and the difficulties that this island went through until very recently. Growing up, until I came to this particular institution at the age of 18, was growing up in London with summer holidays in Tyrone. So that is different from if you'd lived there all your life. Just to show how old I am, the celebrations of 50 years in 66. And it's certainly been interesting as to my vague memories of that as to how the Irish state has adapted. I think in particular, attending the unveiling of the Glasnevin Memorial Wall in April. And I am pretty sure I was the only Northern Ireland politician was there, which I found slightly surprising. Was an illustration of the formal institutions of the state recognising the tragedy and how it affected so many people from so many different backgrounds. When you see names listed which go from civilian to Staffordshire Regiment to Irish Volunteer, with that differentiation, it does state all the tragedies that were incurred. In simple terms, because I thought Glasnevin was, as indeed was the event in the Abbey Theatre, from rising to reconciliation. I think both of those were attempts to be more inclusive, more reflective. I found it particularly difficult as Minister of Justice at the time. As Minister, one of whose staff, a prison officer, had been murdered just a few weeks before by people who would claim to be the inheritors of 1916. I found the concept of celebrating the rising a very difficult one. Recognising, reflecting, commemorating, yes, and that's what the other events did. Although, in fairness, there was a lot more balance perhaps than might have been. But I think there were difficulties in the way Easter Sunday was marked, which to some extent feed into what I regard as a bit of a myth, the blood sacrifice myth, which attempted to equate Easter with the rising. I think the real Easter is something slightly different. I suppose, as having described myself as not quite a pacifist, I'm not terribly impressed by large military parades. I'm not sure that the Irish state is actually terribly good at emulating the worst excesses of the USSR on North Korea. And in that sense, it was slightly funny because if there's an issue about marking one stage in the evolution of the state, marking it in such a militaristic way didn't seem to me to quite recognise all the subtle nuances of what went on. I think in fairness, those who've been running commemoration events in both ends of the island have done a reasonably good job of doing things in a balanced kind of way. I mean, for example, I mentioned the Abbey Theatre event. I thought that was very significant, that there were elements of it which I found slightly uncomfortable from the perspective of a Liberal politician who isn't quite a pacifist. There were elements which I suspect would have been uncomfortable to others who were there in different areas in different ways. And I think the ability to run an inclusive event like that, which left everybody feeling slightly uncomfortable but a little bit more about understanding how others felt, was a very positive way of marking it. And I suppose I particularly enjoyed the fact that we were invited to dinner in Ivey House immediately afterwards, that rounded off a very pleasant day, more pleasant than some of the ministerial visits I had to pay to Dublin in difficult times when we were looking at tragedies and difficult effects. In terms of Northern Ireland, I think certainly there was more of a recognition than there might have been in previous years of the fact, bluntly, that the 16th Division was there as well as the 36th. So there was a greater recognition. It was still, to some extent, seen as a unionist event, but it was done in a bit more of a balanced way. I think the way in which people attempted to present the commemoration of the Easter Rising was done in a more balanced way than has been done previously. So it still created some difficulties for me in the concept of those who believe in the concept of parliamentary democracy and using votes rather than using violence. But it was, I accept something which is seen as the marking of the start, the start of the state. Personally, I'm looking forward to seeing whether I get an invitation to, for example, attend the centenary of the first Dáil, which, whatever one might think about the defects of the British electoral system and so on and so forth, at least was an attempt at moving into democracy and away from violence. I'm not sure if people particularly noticed it. I mean, I did find a certain irony in it, given that her grandfather and my grandfather both signed the Ulster Covenant. I do recall an interesting conversation I had in September 2012 with the Lord Chief Justice, in which he referred to it as a seditious document, to which I said, I'm not sure every small farmer in County Tyrone realised that, which he commented, no, they probably didn't, but the people who wrote it did. Fascinating to see Heather from that background as a Monaghan Presbyterian and a century ago a Unionist family as the minister who led the commemorations. I don't think it had any great effect in Northern Ireland. Whether it had any effect in the Republic, of people recognising that this was a minister whose background would have seen as, seen as very traditionally different, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly there was an element of that, as I said, the recognition of the 16th Division as well, the fact that elements of the commemorations were involving Irish state figures alongside British state figures, alongside the Northern Irish bit. Perhaps it's also important that people in Northern Ireland were reminded that there were actually significant numbers of soldiers from across the water who died as well. But I think it's somehow it managed to get a bit more openness. I suppose that's also followed through, for example, on the work that my former colleague Alan Shatter did a couple of years ago in terms of the pardon for those who, quote, deserted from the Defence Forces in order to join the British or American forces against the Nazis. It's all about the complexity of history of these islands, and people need to get the opportunity to learn that the simplistic monotones of black and white really aren't the correct case. It's interesting to some extent how much more people have been thinking about things. Now, whether the centenary was the point of build-up and the interest fades away slightly after this, I'm not sure. I mean, you can't run an event on the 1st of July every year if you're also running an event on the 11th of November every year and so on. But I certainly think the opportunity for people to look in a bit more depth and a bit more detail, the elements of the media which were actually quite useful in terms of telling the tale in a slightly different way, has been quite positive in that respect. The fact that people are now talking openly in a way that wasn't particularly acknowledged, that when Major Willie Redmond was brought in from in front of the trenches, it was actually two Protestant Ulstermen who dragged him home. That kind of thing has shown that there was a unity which people hadn't necessarily recognised, with all the difficulties of what followed immediately from that. But I think dealing with the issue as to how we address the act of partition and so on will continue to present challenges. And I suspect, says he tried not to be too rude, but I suspect as a northerner, looking at how the wall continues to be filled up in Glasnevin with the names of those who died in the Civil War, will create some greater difficulties.